Conmen, cold, callous, and cunning. These professional liars ruthlessly manipulate the trusting, vulnerable and law-abiding, defiling their bank accounts and violating their lives. This series dissects the psyches of the world's most dangerous con men and women, candidly exploring these mysterious predators and uncovering how their duplicity and deceit led to their downfall and eternal notoriety. In this show, the incredible story of Britain's youngest conman who posed as a tycoon and swindled more than £250,000 from the tender age of 13.
James Cameron was one of Britain's biggest internet conmen.
But amazingly, this criminal was not technically a conman. He was just a boy.
It's unbelievable, really, that a 13-year-old could actually pull off such a sophisticated and ultimately quite successful con.
Throughout his teenage years, James Cameron conned people out of thousands and thousands of pounds.
I mean, he gleefully sat in the back of the car sucking a lollipop, and he just sort of sat as if innocently in the back, not admitting that he was a fraudster or anything like that.
In July 2005, a young woman was waiting outside a cafe bar in London to meet her potential new employer.
The job was for PA to the director of a company called Worldwide Stationery, and it was advertised in the Evening Standard in London, but also at local job centres. I got the number and decided to give him a call.
The job on offer seemed too good to be true.
The initial thing that was attractive about the job is that it was paying £32,000 a year, which even for some of the top PAs in London is above probably the average of about 30 grand. So it certainly looked very tempting.
So on that morning in London, the candidate found herself waiting outside a bar for her interview.
I saw him arriving in a dark blue Mercedes, chauffeur-driven. He was immaculately dressed. Very tall, skinny, very young looking, and yet incredibly confident with it. So, he seemed to be a young entrepreneur, very successful.
Although young in appearance, the entrepreneur seemed every inch the high-flying businessman.
He immediately presented me with some documents which were relating to one of the 4 companies he said he owned. There was one relating to a car hire firm with sort of executive travel from airports to central London. He told me he was also setting up a catering firm called London Snacks, and that his main business was Worldwide Stationery.
The entrepreneur's overwhelming confidence seemed no different to any other successful businessman. But there was a difference. He was lying, because in reality he was a con man. In fact, he was not even a man. He was just a boy.
It's hard to believe that in 2005, James Cameron was just 14 years old and had already been operating as a con man for a year.
So we really see him putting on the dog in style. He's got all the trappings: a chauffeur-driven limo, smart designer suits, even, plausible, pretentious business card.
And in July 2005, the teenager posing as the high-flying tycoon began the job interview with his potential new PA.
He told me that the job would be based from home largely, which also sounded really appealing. And he was kind of sketchy when I asked him where his offices were based. He said that my role would have involved setting up accounts with various companies and staying in touch with them all and kind of doing a lot of the face-to-face work because I imagined he was too busy for that kind of thing.
James Cameron, within the previous year, had conned people he had bogusly employed, and it seemed he had his sights set on his next victim.
I took a long copy of my CV. He wasn't really interested in it. He sort of just put it to one side, offered me the job there and then. He said it would be 2 months holiday a year, working 5 days a week, but the hours could be as little as 10 till 3 each day. Just sounded too good to be true.
But James Cameron's candidate already knew that. She knew that the job was a fantasy, and the youth sat opposite her, a criminal. In fact, on this rare occasion, James Cameron was the one who was actually being conned. The woman he was interviewing was Emily Nash, an undercover journalist from the Daily Mirror. She was simply there to see the con man kid with her own eyes and had no intention of accepting his bogus job offer.
I was tipped off by a member of the public who had gone to work for him and had then been warned by the police that he was a con man.
The woman who contacted Emily Nash had been conned in exactly the same way James Cameron was attempting to dupe the undercover journalist.
This was a woman who only worked for him for about 3 weeks, and fortunately for her, she was tipped off by the police, and I think she was owed a couple of £1,000 all in all by the time she confronted him. He told her, you know, there's nothing you can do about this, you can't touch me, I'm a minor.
The con man was a minor. He was just 14 years old. When Emily Nash met the teenager in July 2005, he had already been scamming people for 12 months. But he wasn't as untouchable as he believed himself to be.
In the January of 2005, he'd been arrested over a different scam, and police were keeping an eye on him. When they realised that he'd started hiring people to work for him, they moved in to warn them.
The police had warned off the con man kid's latest employee, who in turn had contacted Emily Nash.
When I was tipped off about the story, I thought it sounded too crazy to be true, but I decided that we should have a look at it anyway, and so we arranged this meeting. When he arrived, I was just taken aback that he was quite as cocky and audacious as he was, knowing what I knew.
Oblivious to the fact that Emily was working undercover, the 14-year-old seemed impressed with his candidate.
He offered me the job so quickly, I was astonished. I told him that I'd need to think about it, and he was a bit taken aback by that. I don't think anyone had ever refused him before.
But the con man kid insisted Emily take the contract with her.
Along with the contract, he gave me a pen which was engraved with his name, his mobile phone number, and the website for one of his companies.
And James Cameron wrapped up the interview like any legitimate business meeting.
He asked me to call him as soon as I'd made a decision. He's very friendly, shook my hand, and he headed back off into his chauffeur-driven car, and I went back to my office.
But it wasn't the last Emily heard from the con man kid.
If I remember rightly, it was actually him who called me later that day to ask me again, you know, what my thoughts were about the job. And at that point, I had to tell him that something else had come up and I wasn't going to be able to take him up on the offer. He was very polite, seemed a bit disappointed, but I think he said something like, I'm interviewing loads of people, so it's not a problem.
Emily Nash had eluded Britain's youngest con man. A con man who knew that his age was his greatest asset. An asset that not only ensured his anonymity while he duped grown adults out of hundreds of thousands of pounds, but also something he would go on to use as his ultimate weapon.
One disgruntled customer tried to confront him, and James told the man that if he went to the police, he would tell the police that the man had been interfering with him.
When journalist Emily Nash met James Cameron for a job interview in July 2005, she knew a great deal more than many of his victims. She knew he was a con man, and most shockingly, he was only 14 years old.
When we first met, James and I were deceiving each other. He had no idea that I was an undercover reporter from the Daily Mirror, and he also didn't know that I was aware that he was actually a con man. He was very lanky, slightly awkward looking with hindsight, and a little bit spotty, to be honest, as you know, tend to get with teenagers.
But unlike most teenagers, the 14-year-old had already been operating as a con man for a year.
James Cameron's criminal career started when he was just 13 years old.
His first scam began in July 2004, where he set up a website. He was offering plasma TVs for sale at bargain prices, and the way it worked is that people would place an order with him and he would then not deliver the goods.
Internet scams are rife, but this was orchestrated by a boy aged just 13. A boy who saw the Leonardo DiCaprio film Catch Me If You Can at an impressionable age.
James seems to have been inspired by the film Catch Me If You Can, which also has a very young teenage con man at the centre of the plot. He was at some point overheard telling friends, I feel just like the Catch Me If You Can kid.
The feature film was based on the criminal career of con man Frank Abagnale Jr., and parallels can be drawn between him and James Cameron.
Both young men came from relatively humble backgrounds. Neither were interested in a formal education, but they were both very bright and intelligent and understood the power of money from an early age.
James Blake Cameron was born in 1990. He grew up in London with his mother, but he never lived with his father. His idol, Frank Abagnale's career began after his parents' divorce. Similarly, an earth-shattering event happened to James Cameron shortly before his teenage tycoon scan began.
Sadly, James's mother lost a battle with cancer when he was just 11, and this seems to have been a big event in his life, understandably, and it wasn't very long afterwards that he began his conning.
The loss of a parent is always tragic, always devastating, but that isn't an excuse for what James Cameron goes on to do. At 13 years old, he's not going to have a full appreciation of the con that he's pulling off. He's not going to fully understand what his actions are going to mean to other people, but nevertheless, he knows that it's wrong and he knows that it's illegal.
Because James Cameron never lived with his father, after his mother's death, he moved in with his grandmother, who lived in West London.
I was told that James inherited around £16,000 when his mother passed away, and that he'd spent quite a lot of the money buying books about criminology and business, which he seems to have read up on quite a lot.
After studying his books, in July 2004, James Cameron, from his grandmother's home, launched his fraudulent website, and the teenager's conman career began.
The bogus website that was offering these plasma TVs seemed to be a big success. I think he took tens of thousands of pounds worth in orders.
In this internet age, classic scams are kind of updated to basically become simple mail fraud, which is where you send someone some money and then they don't send someone what they said they were going to. So thanks to the internet, there's a lot more mail fraud around.
Customers were ordering TVs from the website and sent their money off to James Cameron, expecting their plasma. A small few received their purchase, meaning the teenage con was receiving good reviews online. However, the majority sent their checks and received absolutely nothing. And the schoolboy was soon awash with money.
He was receiving thousands and thousands of pounds worth of cheques and postal orders, and he had to start opening several bank accounts just to deal with the influx of money.
Just 13 years old, James Cameron was up and running in business. Only his business was ripping people off.
I think that any non-direct con is always easier to pull off because that person doesn't have to actually think about the consequences to the victim. But I think particularly for a 13-year-old, he was probably able to convince himself that, oh, this isn't really any big deal and actually I'm very clever.
As the money flooded in between July and October 2004, James Cameron's confidence as a con man grew.
Well, having started off in his grandmother's spare room, he expanded his base of operations and decided to take offices in London, fully paid, staffed offices.
At this point, he's really upping his game. He wants to take the con to another level because he's that ambitious. And to do so, he has to start being directly manipulative. So he's really starting to hone his con man skills.
As well as renting offices, James Cameron decided he needed staff to help run his bogus empire.
Quite a few people responded to James's adverts that he placed in the job centre and in newspapers.
The confidence of this 13-year-old is really quite astounding. It's not a faceless crime anymore, and he's actually convincing adults that he is legitimate and he is a good business prospect. So you have to wonder, how did a 13-year-old get that precocious?
But the offices and the staff were just a new element in the 13-year-old's con.
James was able to get access to services because he did it all on credit. He would open up a credit account with, say, an office rental company, move in for a few weeks, and then possibly write them a cheque for the rent, which would bounce. When they pursued him, he would just disappear, move on to new premises. He owed one landlord about £8,000 for the first office that he tried to rent, and when they came after him, he went straight on to the next one.
The con man kid also would not pay the staff he hired. The teenager was duping adults out of thousands of pounds and faced no consequences. It seemed the schoolboy was enjoying his criminal extracurricular activities.
Quite early on in his criminal career, James Cameron gave up on his full-time education because he was just too busy conning people.
We all know that teenagers are difficult. They are typically belligerent and they are capable of being thoroughly obnoxious. But this boy is really taking it to new heights. And the frightening thing is that he's got far too much power and control than is safe in the hands of a teenager, a person who is not fully developed emotionally. He is in charge of not only himself, but also of employees who think that he is an entrepreneur, albeit a rather spotty entrepreneur. And that's really quite frightening. I imagine he thought there was nobody that could stop him at that point.
In fact, the conman kid seemed to feel so invincible that he developed more bogus websites, including 2 stationery companies and an online dating website, as well as advertising discount vacuum cleaners in national newspapers in order to dupe people out of their hard-earned cash. And now making serious money, the teenager, like his role model, Frank Abagnale Jr., was living the high life.
He liked to travel in chauffeur-driven cars. He told people that public transport was for commoners. He ran up a bill of £3,085 with one firm alone.
And when angry victims tracked the conman kid down, he would simply use his youth to his advantage.
Where's the money you owe me, mate?
He was running up these bills with taxi firms all over town, and when they tried to confront him, he would just tell them, "I'm sorry, you can't touch me, I'm a minor."
He was laughing at people and saying, well, you can't touch me because I'm a minor. And of course he was correct. People couldn't physically put their hands on him because of course that would be assault. And of course he is only a child, although a child who I've no doubt would have been savvy enough to have claimed compensation had they done that. But not only is he manipulating people, but he's very successfully manipulating the system.
He was really taunting people and provoking them, and it's probably just as well he ran off when he did.
I imagine that the people dealing with him would have felt that this is a child who is totally obnoxious. They would have thought of him as Damien from The Omen, but what could they do about it? They must have been incredibly annoyed by him. And yes, had he stayed around, I imagine that things would have got a bit out of hand.
But the conman's tactics to evade prosecution and to avoid paying up show just how cruel the conman kid could be.
I want my money.
One disgruntled customer actually went to James's address, which was on all of his business correspondence, and tried to confront him over it, and James told the man that if he went to the police, he would tell the police that the man had been interfering with him.
I'll go to the police.
Well, go to the police. I'll go to the police and say you touched me, you pervert.
He understood that his youth gave him power, and he abused that power in the most arrogant and bullying way.
While the teenage trickster was obnoxiously using his youth to his advantage, the long arm of the law were closing in.
When James skipped out of the second office he'd hired in London, the landlord called the police.
However, the police had no idea the crime they were investigating was the work of a conman who had not even started shaving yet. But they quickly tracked the internet conman to his latest bogus office setup in Richmond in London.
When police arrived at the office premises, they found it was empty. We think that he'd seen them coming and just fled out the back.
Pretty clever the way that he is careful to avoid getting pinned down, because staying on the move is absolutely essential for the conman.
Well, I wonder whether he was frightened by this whole episode or whether actually it was quite exciting for him. I imagine he thought it was a bit of a game. Not only is he duping people, but now he's actually evading the police as well. I imagine that that's quite a thrill for a 13-year-old boy.
The main motivation for the conman often isn't money, and part of it is that they have a self-image of themselves as a cut above normal people, as smarter than the average Joe. And so one of the motivations of the conman is he really gets a buzz from putting one over on individual marks, but also on society itself, and just proving that he's better than all those schmucks out there.
Now aware that the police were looking for him, 13-year-old James Cameron seemed to view the game of cat and mouse as an opportunity to develop his criminal mindset.
He started using aliases. He would use his middle name, Blake, call himself Blake Cameron, he would use other men's names, and even on one occasion called himself Amy in email correspondence, so he was able to continue setting up accounts.
And it seemed that deceiving car and taxi firms was not enough for James Cameron. The teenage con was considering a new mode of transportation.
On one occasion, he took one of his PAs, who was unaware of what was going on, to an airfield somewhere in Northamptonshire, I think, to inspect Learjets, having told the staff there that he might be using them for his business travel.
I mean, he must have been dizzied by his own success sometimes. You know, he was only a teenager, and yet there he was going to view private jets. Maybe he was probably tempted to see how far he could push the envelope.
The staff at the airfield were very attentive. They saw him as someone who could potentially spend a great deal of money with them, and James seemed to really enjoy this. He told his secretary as they left that he loved having people sucking up to him.
The conman kid did not buy a plane, but it seemed the ego had landed.
This is a 13-year-old who thinks that public transport is for commoners and has a secretary. I mean, it really is ridiculous, isn't it? It's almost laughable, but actually it's really quite worrying, and you do wonder whether this is somebody who is a narcissist and you're just starting to see really quite disordered behaviour.
But as his cons and scams were becoming more intricate and outlandish, the police finally caught up with the teenager and took him in for questioning.
James was first arrested in around January of 2005. He was arrested over the TV screens that weren't being sent to people.
For most young boys, this would be quite a frightening experience, and it might be enough to actually give them that wake-up call and think, oh, just a minute, I need to change my behaviour here.
But the arrest and investigation was not enough to stop the teenager. And James Cameron's behaviour became more and more outlandish.
He set up a lingerie website. He hired models and got to hang around with them in their underwear, which must be every teenage boy's fantasy.
An outlandish and outrageous fantasy that would signal the beginning of the dramatic end for the con-man kid. In 2004, James Cameron had been arrested for fraud after conning customers via a bogus website he set up. However, released under investigation in early 2005, the con-man kid just continued conning.
This boy was only 13 years old, and yet even after his arrest, if anything, his cons became even more ambitious.
James Cameron's initial scam was a website claiming to sell bargain-priced plasma TVs. Most of his customers never received their purchases, and the teenage trickster pocketed the money. After his plasma TV success, the teenager also developed 2 online stationery firms which earned him further fraudulent money.
The website had worked well for the young con man, so even though he was on bail, he continued to set up more and more online businesses.
Aside from the stationery supplies that he was offering on websites, he started advertising Dyson vacuum cleaners in national newspapers, and he got quite a big response to those. It was just around the Christmas period, and he took, I think he told one staff member, about £20,000 in the December alone.
James Cameron was barely a teenager, but was fraudulently making masses of money from his online businesses. He also continued indulging his passion for conning car firms.
In March 2005, posing as a woman called Gemma, he set up a private chauffeur account and spent £4,000 travelling the UK.
He ran up one bill of £7,293 in the June of 2005, and just a few months later, in the April of 2006, he had his account closed by another firm after running up a bill of £5,543.
He then has the audacity to set up yet another account at the same firm using a different name and runs up a bill of £5,000, which of course is never paid.
As the con-man's mantra of public transport being for commoners spiralled, he also continued his need to surround himself with PAs and staff.
In July 2005, around about the same time that I met him, he ran up a bill with another recruitment agency of £3,161.
James Cameron owed thousands and thousands of pounds across London and had no intention of ever settling his accounts.
Regardless of his age, there can be no question that he knew what he was doing was absolutely illegal and unacceptable because he was putting safeguards in place. But as a 13-year-old, did he really fully understand the emotional impact of his behaviour on other people?
Whether he understood or not, James Cameron was living a life most people only dream of, by conning people into believing he was a legitimate entrepreneur.
He was taking business trips to Edinburgh and Paris, having vintage champagne delivered to his door, wearing designer suits, going to top London nightclubs and bars, and even hiring a bodyguard at one point when I think he worried that customers might come looking for him. He was really setting himself up almost like one of the young royals, like William or Harry, certainly when he started having riding lessons and going to polo matches.
And James Cameron was not only living the high life, he was also intoxicated by the power he had over the people he bogusly employed.
Well, he won't eat sandwiches with the crusts on, and he actually had somebody who would come and remove those for him. Well, that's just ridiculous, isn't it? And it's also dangerous because he's a very young boy, and at this time he's developing his adult personality. And actually what he's going to develop is a very disordered view of himself and of the world. He's going to think of himself in very narcissistic terms. He'll think that he's special, he's superior, he deserves special attention from other people. Other people are just there to tend to his whims. That's a very unhealthy worldview.
As far as James Cameron was concerned, he was king of the world.
People who worked for him said he was quite a snob. He tended to look down on other people a lot, seemed to think he was something special, and was really quite arrogant in the way he dealt with them.
If there's no one sensible to say to James Cameron, no, actually young man, this is ridiculous, it just isn't happening, then this is a very dangerous state of affairs. And obviously, if you pay people a wage to be sycophants, then obviously your ego is going to get out of control and your behaviour is going to get more outlandish.
But the teenager also seemed to enjoy his outlandish behaviour being witnessed by his staff.
People he hired, who obviously believed he was a legitimate tycoon and not a teenage con man, considered him to be quite generous in many respects. He would take them for days out to the polo, go to top restaurants for lunch. He'd pick the bill up for everything. They'd go out drinking together. It was just that when it came to actually paying their wages, he didn't deliver.
He would use excuses like, oh well, the bank was shut, or there was some reason why he couldn't get to the bank to pay them. Fairly plausible reasons, and because he was flashing the cash in trendy wine bars, the staff thought, well, he's obviously got the money, so I assume he's going to pay me eventually. But unsurprisingly, there was a very high staff turnover.
I think most of the people he took on, the PAs, had been offered the same package that I had, which was about £32,000, and they were promised various other perks. I know that in one case there was a lady who couldn't afford her travel card because she hadn't been paid. Instead, he ordered cars for her to take her to and from work.
None of his staff had any idea that the budding tycoon had given up school to pursue a life of crime and was on bail awaiting a hearing at the youth court. A hearing that kept being pushed back because of the teenager's relentless conning.
As the police talked to him, he admitted everything he was accused of, but when it came to trying to formally charge him, new evidence kept coming to light, which meant that they then had to go back and process that.
But although the con man kid was facing the prospect of prison, he could not give up living his ultimate teenage fantasy.
He set up a lingerie website called Finest Lingerie Online. He had to obviously illustrate that in some way. He placed adverts in a leading women's magazine, and to do that he hired models and a photographer to take photos of these lovely young ladies in their underwear.
I'm sure it's every teenage boy's dream to run a lingerie store. In fact, most would probably just settle for a quick peek at the underwear section of their mum's catalogue. But not for James Cameron. No, he had to hire models to strip and parade around in skimpy underwear. So it seems to me that his cons were now starting to fulfil every facet of his fantasies.
The day after the lingerie advert was first published, James Cameron, now aged 16, appeared at Balham Youth Court in London, finally facing judgment for his scams that had spanned 3 years and seen him con almost £200,000 from customers, landlords, employees and service industries.
His first court appearance, he pleaded guilty to all charges. It quickly emerged that he'd been very prolific. He admitted to 16 charges of fraud, which amounted to about £50,000, and he asked for another 105 similar charges to be taken into consideration, which had an estimated value of about £135,000.
When someone admits to committing a large number of offences of a similar nature, burglaries, thefts, whatever, it's quite common for them to be charged with just a handful, a sample of those offences, so that those offences can be proved in court individually. The court then allows them to have all the rest of those offences as what they call taken into consideration. That means that they're all admitted, but the police don't have to prove every single one.
James Cameron's con man career was unprecedented. He had committed these crimes between the ages of 13 and 16. A newsworthy story, but problematic for Emily Nash and the other journalists present at the hearing.
Because he was only 16, we were able to run the story after his conviction at Balham Youth Court, but we weren't able to name him.
Under UK law, you're treated as a child, a juvenile, until your 18th birthday. This means that your name and photograph can't be released in any report about criminal proceedings, and this gives them a protection so that once they reach adulthood, they can put behind them the problems or mistakes they may have made as children.
And that meant, as a child, James Cameron had been blessed with the one gift most criminals dream of: anonymity. That anonymity meant from the age of 13, Cameron could safely con, knowing he would never be publicly named until he turned 18. And in court, the full extent of what this enabled him to do was exposed.
He took thousands of pounds for vacuum cleaners that never arrived, TVs that disappeared. He hired staff that were never paid, and offices were left thousands of pounds out of pocket for unpaid rent.
Police think that the amount he was charged over in that first hearing was only scratching the surface, and that his actual scamming had probably amounted to something more like £250,000.
And on the 2nd of July 2007, the youth court was ready to pass sentence on the 16-year-old.
James was sentenced to 6 months in a youth custody centre and got another 6 months of community service. The judge also stipulated that he could no longer use taxi firms, hire chauffeurs, or offer any goods for sale via the internet.
So he's been to prison by the time he's 16, and he's in a very privileged position of actually having his name withheld from the media, so people don't know what he's been getting up to. This should have been his golden opportunity to go straight, if you like, but does he take that opportunity? Unfortunately, no, he doesn't.
James Cameron ignored the restrictions the judge stipulated in court and simply resurrected his con when he was released.
He again started using chauffeur-driven cars and taxis to take him around London. He was visiting strip clubs and other nightclubs. He even went to a lot of parties during London Fashion Week. By the time he was 17, he was running up taxi fares of £150 per night.
It was during this period that James Cameron was using and abusing a London firm called Climate Cars.
We operate mainly with account customers, so businesses will open accounts with us, which is in fact what James did. The reason that we spotted James abusing his account was that on one day he racked up bills of £281.
But that was just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, in total, it was effectively over 2 months, he spent over £4,000.
Suspicious and potentially £4,000 out of pocket, Nico was then tipped off by a colleague about another taxi firm who James Cameron had been using.
We rang this company up and said, do you know a guy called James Cameron? You know, he's been using us. And they said, whoa, hold on, this guy owes us £5,000 or whatever it was. Do not extend credit to him. He's a con man, etc., etc. At that point, we really realized we were in trouble.
Nico Williamson and his firm were the latest in a long line of taxi firms to be conned by the teenage trickster. He was determined to confront him.
Well, next time he booked a car, we decided that it was best that I went to go and pick him up with our fleet managers to try and talk to him and see, what the situation was, whether he was ever going to pay our bills. He gleefully sat in the back of the car, sucking a lollipop, and said, "Oh, well, the invoices aren't due yet. I've still got 14 days left, or whatever it was." And he just sort of sat as if innocently in the back, not admitting that he was a fraudster or anything like that.
Although he seemed completely unfazed, the con man kid was in fact looking for an exit when he heard of Nico's plan.
Well, the plan was to take him to the police station, but he ran off by that point. We never managed to actually get him to the police station, so the result was we just had to report it.
And Nico was made aware of the bigger picture. He had been duped by a teenage con man between July and August 2008, and he would never be paid the thousands of pounds he was owed.
He spent just over £4,000 with us, including VAT, so we had to write off that as bad debt, which we were a relatively young business at the time. It was a pretty painful exercise, but nonetheless, we've learned something out of it.
But Nico Williamson's firm were not the only company to learn hard lessons because of the con man kid.
Another taxi company from Hackney contacted the police in September 2008 and said that between July and August of that year, he had run up a bill of £4,582. That's nearly £5,000 in 2 months.
What James Cameron is doing is stealing services from people. It may sound like a cashless crime, but actually these people are expecting payment and they're dependent on that money.
And James Cameron's relentless conning of London taxi and car firms continued.
In September 2008, a black cab company from Harrow in North London came forward, saying that they were owed £21,000 by him.
James Cameron's aversion to public transport was costing London's taxi firms tens of thousands of pounds. But as well as taking countless cab firms for a ride, James Cameron also scammed other services via the internet.
Between April and June of 2008, a stationery company provided James Cameron with office supplies totalling about £7,815. He paid for them by cheque, but the cheque again bounced.
And the teenage tearaway also reverted to a con he began shortly before he was placed in youth custody.
During the hearing in 2007, when James Cameron was given 6 months, it was said in court that his lingerie company was actually legitimate. But after his subsequent release, he carried on with that business, and it clearly wasn't legitimate.
It appeared that even when living out every teenage boy's fantasy, James Cameron could not resist ripping people off.
For his fashion website, he was hiring models, photographers, professional hair and makeup artists, and studio space for days at a time, and then not paying any of the people involved. So he was effectively obtaining services by deception, but at the same time having a bit of fun.
Again, we've got scantily clad models parading around for the benefit of a spotty teenage entrepreneur. Benny Hill humour. But then these are professional people, probably very hard-working people who were expecting to get paid.
The modelling agency lost out on about £10,000 because obviously it had to pay the models, having actually sent them out to do the job. The studios again lost thousands, and the self-employed photographers were particularly hard hit, and I think the fee they agreed was £8,500.
But she never received the money, despite contacting the con man kid's bogus company.
At the same time, this company, Urban Fashion, sends her an email, which in fact is James Cameron sending her an email, saying that the company was in fact going into voluntary liquidation.
The photographer never saw the £8,500 she was owed, and she went to the police. And she was not alone. The police were once again inundated with complaints from victims of the teenage conman, victims he had duped since being released from youth custody in 2007. Once again, James Cameron was arrested and a court date set for October 2009. Judgment Day was looming for the con man.
The difference is that James Cameron is now no longer a child. He's not the con man kid anymore. In fact, in the eyes of the law, he's an adult, and so he's going to stand trial as a man.
Aged 18, it seemed James Cameron's luck had finally run out. From the age of just 13 years old, James Cameron had relentlessly conned innocent people out of thousands and thousands of pounds. In 2007, aged 16, the con man was sentenced to a youth custody centre for 6 months. But upon release, he continued to con people to live out his teenage fantasies.
His frauds went on for 5 years, and despite the best endeavours of the social services, the police and the probation service, all trying to get him back on the straight and narrow, but he just decided that just wasn't for him.
In October 2009, aged 18, James Cameron appeared at Southwark Crown Court, pleading guilty to crimes he committed between 2007 and 2008, amounting to £20,000. For the first time in his 5-year con man career, the con man kid was being tried as a man.
This was the first time that James had actually appeared in an adult court. He'd obviously been conning people throughout his teenage years, almost anonymously, because of the legal system preventing him from being named. But this time round, he was being seen in the eyes of the court as a man.
However, when being sentenced just 2 weeks before his 19th birthday, James Cameron seemed to be even luckier than he was when he was a child.
In spite of everything, he wasn't jailed. He was given a 50-week suspended sentence and put under a supervision order. He was also instructed not to take loans of more than £250.
James didn't learn his lesson as a younger teenager, and now, after being tried as a man, he was punished, but he still got to go home and sleep in his own bed that night. And I imagine that must have frustrated an awful lot of people. Given his history, I expect that a lot of them were questioning exactly what kind of message is the legal system sending out to him.
However, the con man kid had been so prolific in his criminal career that in the same month as his first appearance at Southwark Crown Court, the Crown Prosecution Service brought further charges against the con man. October 2009 had been a busy month for Cameron. He had turned 19, been sentenced for the first time at Crown Court, and was now facing further charges, which he was pleading guilty to.
James was prosecuted and convicted of 8 counts of fraud by false representation, 1 charge of obtaining property by deception, and 1 charge of obtaining services dishonestly.
It was a fraud totalling £82,000 and related to all those high-end luxury service industry scams and all those taxi scams as well.
In March 2010, James Cameron returned to Southwark Crown Court to be sentenced for his cons worth an astounding £82,000. He stood in the dock facing the same judge he had stood before just 5 months earlier and who had let him walk away from court with a non-custodial sentence.
The judge actually said to him that if he'd known earlier on, when he gave him the suspended sentence, that the amount he had defrauded was close to £100,000, he had very little doubt that he would have sent James to prison, despite his young age and the fact that he pleaded guilty.
It seemed certain that James Cameron, now being tried as an adult, would be given a custodial sentence for his crimes.
It was a real sense of anticipation in the courtroom that finally justice was actually going to catch up with James Cameron. He looked a bit more nervous than I'd seen him before, and it very much looked like he was going to be going to prison.
However, the judge then stunned the courtroom and the teenager.
Everyone was shocked and stunned in the courtroom when the judge suddenly changed tack. It had gone from looking like a dead cert that James was going to go down for his crimes at last. And then the judge decided that he wouldn't jail him. He again mentioned his young age and the fact that he hadn't offended in the 5 months since his last sentence as being the reasons why he didn't put him in prison.
No one was more surprised than the con man himself when he was given a second 50-week suspended sentence. And outside court, James Cameron looked like the king of the world.
When the judge passed the sentence, James actually looked dumbfounded like the rest of us. I think he just couldn't believe that he wasn't going to go to prison. I actually followed him out of the courtroom and asked him how he felt, and he just said to me, "I wasn't expecting that, were you?"
He also made a statement outside court saying that he was full of regret and remorse.
I asked James if he had anything to say about what had happened, and he just said that the scamming was something he'd begun when he was just 13, and he'd carried on doing it until he'd found something else in his life, which was education.
He was referring to the fact that he had enrolled in college and was studying fashion. But whether or not education will be James Cameron's salvation remains to be seen. When he left court on the 23rd of March 2010, something had changed forever. For 6 years, James Cameron's con games had been played by his rules. But now an adult, the rules had changed.
For the first time in his 6-year criminal career, we could actually name him because he was now an adult.
Well, his name and his face are out there now, so if nothing else, that should at least be a deterrent, because in the past he was just this anonymous teenager who was conning people throughout London. But at least now, if he does start up again, he's more likely to get rumbled.
James Cameron is no longer a child. Now in his 20s, it does appear that the con man kid has given up his life of crime and is committed to getting himself an education and going straight.
It's interesting, Cameron still seems to be following in the footsteps of his role model, Frank Abagnale Jr. to some extent. Abagnale gave up his life of crime and went straight in his 20s, and maybe Cameron will do the same.
There's no doubt that James Cameron was incredibly savvy. He used the protection that his young age would afford him to make hay while the sun shone. Now, I don't know what's in this boy's future. I think he could go one way or another. He could either be the narcissistic career con man, or actually he could use that skill set and be incredibly successful.